Welcome, everyone, to another edition of Stump the Stars Jewish Style. And I do point out that it is Stump the Stars Jewish Style, not stomp on the people who are giving this to you. Having clarified that little bit, we're ready to begin, and it's good to see you all. We've got some questions that are left over from previous weeks, and so we'll begin by dealing with those.
And we have a studio audience.
Yes, we do have a studio audience today, and our studio audience and those who are directly connected to us virtually, you have the opportunity, of course, to ask further questions. What, we should just start with this one?
Whatever you want to do, dear. Do we have a topic of the week or?
Well, we are continuing the one topic of, well, no, that it's not really continued. It's a continued question from a.
No, I meant other than what has been sent to us. Do we have any other topic?
No, we hadn't talked in terms of.
Something may occur to us.
Something may occur to us, or something that our studio audience thinks of.
Our fabulous studio audience.
In fact, why don't we ask them if, do you have any
We'll give you
questions
first
that are,
crack.
yeah, since you are here with us,
Have any
you get
immediate
first crack.
questions?
You get first crack.
Oh, no, we should do the other one. I do have a question. And you wait till you get the old one stuff.
Okay. Well, that's never going to happen. But, we'll get some of them done. We'll get a few of them. Some of them are short answers. I hope
Yes.
everybody understands that. So we have short answer questions, and then there's questions we just look at each other and oh, brother, not because we don't know the answer. It's because it takes a long time. But anyway.
Okay.
Why are you pointing that out to me? Was the Egyptian killing of the children a foreshadowing of Herod's actions? Was the Egyptian, so when Pharaoh had the baby boys killed in Egypt, a foreshadowing of Herod's actions? Well, I have an answer. I would say yes, but I think in a certain way that understanding is the wrong way around. In other words, the gospel writers, we know for sure that Luke did research. He interviewed friends and family. He hung out with Mary a lot because Luke knows what Mary thought. He must have asked her, what were you thinking when this happened? What were you thinking when Gabriel came? What did he say to you? So we know that Luke did research, and I wouldn't be a bit surprised if the others also did some research before they sat down to write the Gospels. And they saw, obviously, what happened during Moses' lifetime as something that foreshadowed Yeshua's birth in his life. So oftentimes, we're so concrete selective in Western society today. We're so, this came first, this came second, this came third, this came fourth, and you cannot mess that up because then people get twirly eyes and they get mad at you. When you start dealing with the timeline is the most important consideration in telling a story. Back in olden times, I would say pre-Middle Ages, they didn't have a problem with changing up storylines and including or not including things that happened. They weren't entranced and guided by this happened first, this happened second, this happened third, and if you get them out of order, it's all wrong and it's therefore not history. That did not bother them so much as it does us. And so when we think of what is recorded to us about Yeshua's life by these four guys, I'm just going to say they're probably guys, whose work that we kept, or the early, what do you call them? What do we call the church fathers?
It's what
We call them the church fathers, even though a lot of them were Jewish for the first 100 years. Is that fair enough to say?
That's fair enough to
Okay. Obviously the gospel writers thought that what happened to Moses, and his part of the story also applied to Yeshua, because Herod is the moral equivalent of Pharaoh. All right, so they saw it in those terms. The context they provided for themselves was that, yeah, the killing of the babies at the beginning of the book of Exodus is a moral equivalency of what Herod did during a certain time period in the winter of BCE 4, BCE year 4. Because reminding yourself always that Yeshua was not born in the year 0. There is no year 0, because it'd be silly if it was June of that year. And so what year is it? The year 6 months? No, it's not. So you go calculating, you go from BCE 1 to CE 1, or BC to AD 1, skipping the 0. See, a lot of things people don't think about because it doesn't occur to them to think deeply about it. Trust us, people have thought deeply about all these issues. Have I,
Yes, there's only one.
are we done with that?
No,
one?
no,
Or
I've
am I-
got further reflection, but just one tweak.
Yes,
Since it was in all likelihood December for Yeshua's birth, technically it was BCE 5, about to become BCE 4, if you're playing that game. The other thing is, and I was going to ask your forgiveness. No, I'm not, but I'll seek your pardon somewhat for turning this into a commercial, but that's one of the reasons for doing this first. What I'm about to share with you, I will share in more detail in the Gospels course coming up in a few weeks.
yes, good plan, dear.
You like that?
It's like they just read right
Fell
into
right
what
into
you
it,
needed
yeah.
to give a commercial.
There's an ancient rabbinic tradition concerning how Herod came about to decide to kill the baby boys. It seems either he consulted with, and I don't remember the exact detail on this, or as part of his court counsel, for lack of a way to put it. I think the rabbinic tradition says soothsayers, but we will call them prophetic types, or what?
Wise guys,
Yeah, well, not wise guys in that sense, but
predictors.
predictors, yes. They met together and they warned him that, and again, I don't remember whether it was his instigation or their instigation. They warned him, these soothsayers did, that someone would arise from the people of Israel who would, and I say this loosely, overthrow Herod to some degree. And it's at that point that Pharaoh, we're talking about Pharaoh, not Herod, okay? So either Pharaoh went to these soothsayers, or the soothsayers came to Pharaoh, and they told, and in the discussion, they told him that someone would arise from the people of Israel who would overthrow him and to some extent his kingdom. As a result of this, Pharaoh chose to start killing off the baby boys. All right. Now, with that as part of the historical, and then plus the rabbinic background of the historical, now you can see in even greater detail how the apostolic writers, the writers in the Gospels, used that, or compared their story with that. And as Patrice pointed out, and it's very important, the perspective is different. This is the history that sets the pattern for something later. These people who are later see the pattern. It's not that this is foretelling this, but rather this is recalling that.
That's just like when this happened. See this thing now? It's just like when that happened.
Yeah.
And it's that sort of viewpoint we can take on it.
So anyhow, what happens? If you remember the scene, Herod interacts with the
Wise men, the wise guys.
both the wise men, but I was also thinking the scribes, who tell him, yeah,
Yeah.
it's in Bethlehem that this guy is going to come. And so Herod has the same kind of reaction that Pharaoh did to try to wipe out the one who was a threat to him and to his kingdom. So it's against that backdrop that the gospel writers point out these details and say, oh, look, this is like that. So I think now we've covered.
Have we beaten the
Yeah.
horse to death?
All right. So, and by the way, that concept of patterning and backdrops is found, as Patrice suggested, throughout all of the writings of the Newer Testament. They look at the events and say, "Oh, looky, see what we have here. Isn't that just like what God has already done?" Because they understood that God worked in patterns.
And let me just say, unfortunately, so in not that distant of the past, so within the 20th century, but especially in the 19th and the 18th century, Christians used to look at, they would get the parallel between Pharaoh and the order with the babies and Herod and the order with babies, and they would say, see, the past is just types and shadows. And that was a big tenet of certain theology, was the Old Testament was just types of Yeshua. The whole thing really is about Yeshua. So they really clung onto these stories out of the Tanakh, and they failed to appreciate them. They were only valuable in the sense that they pointed to Yeshua. So they were so oriented about Yeshua, which normally is a very nice thing to be. But if you interpret the past only, it's only valuable because it talks about this guy, you've just denigrated the whole thing. You've taken away the Bible from the apostles. That the only part of the Older Testament that you should be concerned about is the stuff that talks about Yeshua. All of which is not helpful for understanding the New Testament at all. It really harms your understanding of the New Testament. And so anytime people say, and as I said, in the 1800s and the late 1700s, they love to do this. They love to find all the references to Yeshua. And so I'm blaming that particular aspect of scholarship in the 19th and the 18th century as leading vast numbers of people in the churches today to just not even pay any attention to the Old Testament, unless it's one of their favorite Bible stories like Jonah. Okay. So things we often teach children in their childhood are never talked about then when they become adults. And unfortunately, that means the people in the pews are going to maintain their ignorance. So it's tricky, isn't it, dear? It's tricky. And but anytime we can bring forth where there's a melding of the two, that you can't have one without the other. You can't just have the Old Testament. You need the New Testament. You can't just have the New Testament. You also must have the Old Testament. Because if you misunderstand the Old Testament or don't know anything about it, you're going to get the New Testament goofy. I won't say it's going to be wrong. I'm saying it's going to be, you won't be able to understand what's going on.
Fuzzy.
I was going to say Clarence the Cross-Eyed Lion.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if that speaks to anybody, but
The image does.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, I'm of two minds. If we answer this question, which has an Egyptian connection to the previous one, then we're done this sheet. But these people may join us in a couple weeks.
whatever you think. They'll have a.
Okay. All right. Then we're going to
This is a fairly short one too.
Egyptian connection is this. This same questioner asked if all the men of fighting age, 20 plus, was it 20 plus?
Age 20, I believe it was age 20.
Just want to double check that. If all the men of fighting age that left Egypt, besides Joshua, or in this case, actually besides Joshua and Caleb, if they all died before entering the promised land, did they die young? Was the cause? Were the women exempt from this edict? Okay, that has several layers to it. And now that I think of it, this is appropriate because we're reading Deuteronomy, which is Moses' last speech to the people before they entered the promised land. And it was to this generation that had survived. Do you want to start or do you want me to start?
I'll start.
Go.
All right. So this question is under the rubric of what happened in the wilderness, in the desert, which is a better translation of in the wilderness. They're not in a jungle. They go to the desert. And for many years, I thought the wilderness was some of a jungle and you needed a machete. So desert is where it's taking place. Desert. So the people go from Egypt into the desert. And we don't have to take them on their travels. But here's what we do know. Because of the report, remember there was a group of spies was gathered together. They were the representatives of each of the 12 tribes sent 2 men. And these men grouped together and they were sent out on a reconnaissance mission. To use war terminology, they were sent out to go sneak into the promised land, take a look around, see what the state was, see what it looked like, because this is the first time it's been done. It's all theoretical up to the report that these guys are going to bring back. And then they come back, they report to Moses, Aaron, Miriam, the leadership of the tribes, and then they make further plans from there. That does not go well, according to scripture. In other words, the report that they bring back is that they're scared to death, correct? They are scared to death, except for the 2 guys, and we'll put them aside. But the majority report was, it's impossible. We can't do it.
Well,
Yes.
sorry. This just occurred to me, just as a reminder, that event, according to tradition, took place on Tish B'Av, which we commemorated just a few weeks
A
ago.
couple of weeks ago, which is the Tish B'Av is the commemoration of the destruction of the 2 temples, which took place like in the same week. But catastrophe is what Tish B'Av represents. It's a day of mourning. And so the tradition is that they gave their report
That
in the
people-
middle of the long hot summer, like
Yeah,
right
the
now.
people's response was on this day.
Okay, so skipping the details, because now we want to get the big picture. So the big picture is, what are the ramifications and what are the consequences of this decision? Because remember, it was 10-2. So majority obviously won, and the 2 guys who gave what do you call that? The minority report went on to fame and glory in God's sight and were lauded and praised, and their families had great benefits, but not the 10. So the consequences were, we all know, that everyone over the age of 20 was not going to enter the promised land. And that means everyone over the age of 20, men or women, are not going to see the promised land. If we feel sad for them, we grieve for them. If you've never seen the promised land, you may know how they feel, but they've been working and they've been hoping, and they were ready, I think, theoretically, they were ready to go in there and take that land, except when they actually saw the land, and then they were not ready. But don't forget too, and I like to point this out because people don't consciously think about this. And unfortunately, modern people sort of like an excuse to blame that group. Those dumb people, why didn't they say we can do this? Why did they go against what God wanted? Well, they were just dumb. I would follow God more than they did. If you're pointing your finger at them, take your finger and just point it back at yourself, because I can go on, but I'm not going to go on this tack. Just realize they did better than you and I would. So if you think they failed, better look at your own. What does God want me to do, and why am I afraid to do it? Okay, that sermon is now over. Moving on. But everybody below the age of 20 or above the age of 20 years is not going to see the promised land. And everybody below the age of 20 years presumably is going to see the promised land. Now, there was 38 years after the report of that spy committee before they were ready to enter the promised land. Well, in the course of 20 plus 38, the oldest people
The youngest people.
I'm sorry, the oldest people of the group that didn't get banned from the promised land, didn't get
Okay, gotcha.
prevented from going to the promised land. That's quite old for that time period. So 58 would be the oldest, the elders at that point. It's a whole new generation. They have their own, they agreed to their own tribal leaders, and they would be in the 35 to 58 range. It's a new generation that maybe were taken out of Egypt when they were babies and they don't remember Egypt. And also, they might remember Egypt, but it wouldn't have formed the majority of their lives. So, what was the question? Okay, so you do have a
Did they
considerable.
die young?
Did they die young? Well, if they were above age 20, they're going to die. And it seems like to get that amount of dying done before they entered the promised land, it was they figured out something like 1,500 funerals a day. So death was always with them when they're in the desert, because, and I'm not saying God came down with a mighty lightning bolt, and no, they died of natural causes for them, but they were not going to be entering the promised land. Remember, not even Moses was able to enter the promised land. He could see it from afar. He saw it from a mountain across the Dead Sea, and he could see it laying out there like a nice, what I want to say, widescreen cinerama version of the promised land, but he didn't set a foot into it. Whereas those two spies that gave the minority report, they walked in it and they inherited, especially Caleb's family. We're told a whole story about as his family goes on, his daughter, his grandchildren, they had a prime cut of the real estate in southern Judah. So that's a very wonderful story about how Caleb is old. He's really old. He didn't die with a generation. Joshua did not die with his generation. They were older and they got in, and Joshua did a whole bunch of work. I think we think of Joshua like from the movie The Ten Commandments, where it's John Derek, and he was handsome, but he was also like 35 years old. That's not the way Joshua ended up, and that's not the way he looked as he's commanding the forces of the Lord there and trying to take what had been promised to Abraham. So the cause of their death, well, it would be natural causes, but there's a postponement of the blessing because of their unbelief. All right, were women exempt? No, everybody died. Oh, here's these guys. They're going to die early, but the wives, no, that generation had an effect on it. That generation that was there in the desert, they were all affected by it, by the amount of death if you're younger. But it's going to be, and this is also another thing, and with this I'll close, so you better have something pithy. This population, as the older people die, becomes a clean population. They have been sheltered. They have been under social distancing. They have not met one person from any other civilization. So that means that they are pristinely clean, and we're going to assume that they didn't eat any animals that God said not to eat. And they didn't do the things, and they did do the things that God was telling them and teaching them that we have recorded in the first 5 books. So this is an incredibly healthy group of people. They don't have measles. They don't have mumps. They don't, there's ramifications. I'm using those as examples of communicable diseases. Either they brought them in with them or they don't catch them from anybody else. It's a very sheltered group. So that is also important to remember. that there's going to be health ramifications when they go into the promised land. A lot of health ramifications because they're going to enter a world that's built on unclean and germs and literally not washed with soap, literally unclean, not just morally unclean. So yeah, we need to put our own selves. And now that we've had this unbelievable experience that we've had for the past year and a half, it is much easier for us to take notice of it and understand the benefits that they had by following God into the wilderness. And it was like a quarantine in a good way. It was that social distancing from the other empires of the world. Yeah?
Yeah. And let me reemphasize that from my own way of saying it. As Patrice mentioned earlier, the group that was ready to go in to Canaan and therefore what was the promised land had not been as impacted or impacted at all by the Egyptian culture or by the perhaps temptations of Egyptian religion. So they were in that sense recultured. What's the term?
Yeah, enculturated with a new culture.
Enculturated with a new culture. And one that, remember, this group is the one that heard, well, because they had heard the word of the Lord directly from Mount Sinai. This was the first group that would be basically from youth through old age to have been discipled, educated by the actual words of the Torah. So this is a group that was then Torah prepared to go in. Whereas their ancestors, their parents and grandparents, would not have had that intensive education throughout the bulk of their life. Even if someone was 19, it's as if they were entering college. And what was their college degree? Their college degree was a major in Torah. So in that sense, God shaped this group in that way. As Patrice also said, relating it to what we've just gone through, anything that they might have brought with them out of Egypt by way of disease or proclivity, that too would have been erased during this time period, by and large.
Yeah, I think we'd have to think more about that, but we don't know if they had common childhood diseases there.
Yeah.
So there's only a certain amount we can say, but we do know it's a new day.
It's a new day, and there's a certain, for lack of a better term, cleansing going on in a very good way. As Patrice pointed out, the oldest of those who would have survived and were ready to go into the land would have been nearly 60 years old. Well, what was what was the general life expectancy back then? Was it 60? I don't think so. Was it something in the 50s? I'm not sure. It could be something even in the 40s. So these were people who in effect were dying off, as she said, through natural causes. But think of it, and here's where you need a perspective shift. The perspective shift is this. The group that was going into the land now were a miracle generation. Why? Because a good number of them lived longer than they should have lived and got to go in. Certainly Joshua and Caleb outlived life expectancy, and it was a miracle that they got to go in. Those who were going in, who were greater than 50 or 48 or 52 or whatever life expectancy was at that time, that too was a miracle generation going in. God extended their lives so they could go in. So what do? We tend to look at the people that got killed off. No, we need to understand that this was a miracle regarding the people who got to go in.
Well, yeah, and also the circumstances of how they, what other story from an ancient time do you hear about this happening? The whole thing is basically, humanly speaking, unbelievable that this worked like this. So, yeah.
Okay.
I wonder if we've answered that to what they wanted to know. Any other questions that our great esteemed audience can think of about that.
Yeah.
I also wanted to point out, and this is another one of my, it's not a pet peeve, it's a things people should understand, the real life situation. Their attitude about water is different from what it was in Egypt, and it's going to be different from what it will be in Canaan, in Canaan. How did they get their water when they're in the desert? How did they get it? They went and got bottles. Yeah. Where'd they get their water while they were in the desert?
Rain, rocks.
Wells. That's how they get it. Even in the story of Isaac, there's a whole story about him in wells. Because Beersheba, anywhere south of Beersheba is the northernmost city of the desert. A desert, by definition, is that place gets 5 or fewer inches of rain a year. So when they're in the Sinai, they're getting less than 5 inches of rain a year. Your water comes out of wells. So digging a well and having the well be of drinkable water is one of the most important aspects of your life, right? And a well is, you dig down to where the aquifer is. Under the sand is an aquifer where there are running streams that run through underneath us, right? We have sea level. The sea is probably underneath us. We are about 5 feet above sea level, so we don't have that problem. Find the aquifer. They find the aquifer with their well, and then they drain fresh water out of the well because they're nowhere near salt water, right? So they can't make salt water into fresh. How did they get water when they were in Egypt? Wells? The Nile. The Nile. That's where all their water came from. And their lives were governed by the Nile. So God takes them into the desert. Here, learn to live with wells. And instead of being able to see the water rushing by in the spring, everything is aimed at the Nile. So in order to see your water there, we have too much water, way too much water, but the farmers like it. Then they're taken to the desert. See this hole in the ground? You're going to get all the water your family needs out of the hole in the ground. So imagine the learning curve and the mind blowing. And they're going to enter Canaan. Where will they get their water? There. Rain. Absolutely. Rain. Have they dealt that much with rain? No, the 5 inches a year come in the winter time. They come in the winter, and they usually come within 2 weeks. That's all the rain they're going to get for the year. So there is some cisterns. Cisterns are being used. Water collection barrels are being used. If you don't know what a cistern is an underground crypt, a hollow crypt made out of plastered stone that collects rainwater and any water you care to throw down it. So a cistern when they get to the promised land, they're going to collect rain in cisterns. They're going to get it from rain. Well, they had the Jordan River. The Jordan River was never used for the water system in Israel because it was way over there, and you have to get all the water, not very much, in the Jordan and bring it uphill. It has to come almost 2,000 feet uphill. Romans figured out how to do that, but they haven't arrived yet on the scene. So it's their minds are going to be blown at several different times, just as yours would be. If you're used to water, getting it one way, and then it changed to another way, and then it changed to a third way that you knew it as something bad that happened in the middle of the winter for 2 weeks. And now it's going to start regularly raining. And you're not going to get any water unless it rains. Will there be wells, yeah, they'll be down in the southern part near the desert. It's going to be hard for you to trust God to bring rain. So that's the preliminary. That is a whole realm of understanding the people's lives in the desert that carries over into their theological ideas about what God should be doing and what God doesn't have to do.
Related to that, building on that, perhaps a bit of a perspective shifter yet again, and then bringing in another rabbinic tradition. Where were they going to find water in this wilderness experience? If you're thinking that they are digging wells in the sand, think again. If you try to dig a well in the sand, what happens? Right.
More
So
sand.
the only place you're looking for rocky places. And
That
that's-
don't have a lot of sand.
that don't have a lot of sand.
Good point.
All right, now, built on that is the rabbinic tradition that another rabbi refers to in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 4. And it says that there was a rock that followed them through the wilderness, and that rock was the Messiah. There was a rabbinic tradition, going back that far, it obviously still exists, that the way they got water was that there was this well, so to speak, or this rock, so to speak, that followed them. I'm going to elaborate on that in a minute. And that rock is then connected with the Messiah. That's what the rabbinic tradition says. That's what the Rabbi Paul, Rav Shaul, is saying here as well. He's referring to that. Now, I'm going to suggest that that's just a rabbinic way of saying something else. It's not that that rock or that well followed them from place to place. But as they went from place to place under God's direction, God told them where to camp, remember? End of Exodus chapter 40, Numbers chapter 10, earlier on in Numbers as well. The camp moved when God moved. Well, where did God cause them to encamp? And as I think both of us have mentioned from time to time in the past, there are something like 40 campsites that are listed in the text. So at best, they're moving once a year. So they're spending about a year in each place. They're going to want to spend a year where there is water. So it's not that they followed the rock, not that the rock followed them, but they went from place to place where there was a rock that they
God provided.
where the water was provided for them. Does that make sense? Okay. And then you've got the rabbinic tradition that then connects that with the Messiah.
And it's water for millions of people, including their animals.
Yeah.
So it could be certain places the aquifer was running out, and that would be the
And then it's
signal.
time to move.
Then
Yeah.
that would be the human signal to move, but
Yeah.
God would be in charge of knowing how much water was in the aquifer for you.
Okay, radically shifting gears to a question that came in a while ago, which reads, I'm curious if you do a blessing of the bread and wine. I know Messianic congregations are all different. As Yeshua did the Last Supper, when does Or Chadash utilize that? And that is related to a question from a longtime listener and viewer who says, this one may have been asked, but do you know if Jews ever did a communion, or was that a tradition developed among Gentiles? There's an awful lot of hubbub among groups of Gentile believers about communion. Who can, who can't, who's in, who's out. So are we out or in on communion? So the two questions are related over the general topic. So do you want to launch, or do you want me to?
No, I launched on the
Okay,
last
then-
one, so it's time for you to talk too much.
All right, then I'm going to launch this way. Taking some information from the second questioner who actually raised the question earlier, but the second question that I read, what goes on in Messianic congregations? I was going to say decades previous, and actually in the last millennium.
The last century
Last century and last
and
millennium.
millennium.
Yeah. We attended some conferences on a regular basis, which we stopped attending after a while. And on a regular basis, during one of the main nights of the conference, and it would have been Friday night, as part of bringing in Shabbat, brought in Shabbat with what? Lighting the candles and Kiddush. Kaddish, but Kiddush. And I can remember, and I can hear and visualize the person saying this. Joe.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, I thought just
Are you
one.
going to tell him what he really said?
Yes, that's
to the-
exactly where I'm going.
To the 500 people that were watching?
All right, as he's going through Kiddush, he's trying to make a messianic connection. And he literally says, concerning Kiddush, because we use what? Allah and the Kiddush cup. He says concerning the challah, this is representative of the body of Yeshua. And he says of the Kiddush cup, this is representative of the blood or the death of Yeshua. So he connected something. He was trying to make a Jewish connection, but he made the totally wrong connection. Kiddush in no way is ever connected with communion. What is Kiddush associated with? We went through it last night.
Pop quiz.
Commemoration of what?
Shabbat. Shabbat.
It's a commemoration of Shabbat and a commemoration of creation.
Yeah.
That's what it commemorates.
Yeah.
That's what it's always commemorated. In Messianic synagogues who know what they're talking about, and yes, I said it just that bluntly, the connection remains creation and Shabbat. Now, both creation and Shabbat do have connectors to the Messiah, but not to his death and his burial. It has to do with Shabbat and creation. Where historically did communion, as it grew up in the churches, come from? Exactly. It's connected to Passover. It's connected to the matzah and to technically the third cup of the Passover celebration, because that's what Yeshua took when he made the connection to his body given up for us, and when he made connection to his death, the pouring out of his blood, ratifying the covenant that God had promised, the covenant of renewal, the renewed covenant. So if you're looking for a communion connection, you look to Passover. Now, when did this, what is now called communion, or a communion reflection on Passover, initiate? Did it initiate with the Gentiles who fairly early on flooded into this Messianic Jewish faith? Did it come with them rushing in? No. I read 1 Corinthians chapter 10. If you read 1 Corinthians chapter 11, the rabbi goes on to talk about the way in which what is often called communion is badly celebrated by those who celebrate it in Corinth. So already in Corinth, and we're talking now in Corinth probably 40s or 50s.
So
All right, no,
15 or 20 years after you
15 or 20 years
no
after.
longer there.
It's already an established practice. That doesn't mean this is the first time it was practiced. It's an established practice. Was Corinth a Gentile area? Well, how did the congregation of Corinth begin? Read the book of Acts. The rabbi preached and taught where? In the synagogue or synagogues of Corinth. So we're talking about a Jewish congregation. Yes, Gentiles became part of it, but it's a Jewish congregation at its outset. So from the beginning, this is a Jewish thing. Now it became, for lack of a better term, Gentilized in its practice when it lost its connection with communion.
With Passover.
I'm sorry, thank you. When it lost its connection with Passover. Maintained its connection with Passover, at least through the early years, decades, whatever. And so in that sense, where did I want to go with that? It remains a Jewish thing, and Jews did celebrate it. The question was, did Jews ever have a communion? Not the larger Jewish community, because as we've already established, Kiddush is not communion. It's two entirely different things. But the Messianic Jewish community of the early centuries, yes, they did have it, and they connected it with Passover. Now, there's a real question both then and now, and we had this discussion in the early days of this synagogue as well. How often or when do you celebrate communion? And that too was part of the earlier question, the earlier part of the
Well,
question.
it was the Lord's Supper. We never called it.
We didn't call it, well, some people did, but yeah, by and large, we call it the Lord's Supper. But whatever you call it, what is it connected with? There were some who argued, and the argument is sound, that we should only do it as part of the Passover celebration because that's what Yeshua connected to. Others argued that whenever you choose to celebrate it, you remember it as a connection to communion. Now, there are some congregations, and I'm now talking about Gentile congregations, that have historically celebrated communion every week on a Sunday. There are some congregations that celebrated what, quarterly?
4 times a year.
4 times a year. I found out later that there are some congregations who celebrate it daily. In the early days of the Korean church, they felt the need to celebrate this daily. So when's the right time? My answer was pick a time. Here's what we ended up with. We ended up with celebrating it usually when we got together for Saturday night social events of whatever nature, provided the event that evening was not something that was somewhat out of phase with the atmosphere or aura of communion. I'll give you the negative to give you an example. One time when we got together on a regular basis to celebrate it, that we didn't connect it with the Lord's Supper or communion, was during the Purim party. Why? Because the whole atmosphere of the Purim party is not the same atmosphere as you might have, want to have for this particular celebration. We also connected it with Havdalah. Why with Havdalah? Havdalah concludes the Sabbath and begins the first day of the week. When the early believers got together and had the celebration, however often they celebrated it, it was celebrated, the text of Corinthians tells us, on the first day of the week. So building directly on Havdalah, moving on into communion or the Lord's Supper was a natural thing for us to do. And if you think about the emphasis of Havdalah, that makes a lot of sense too.
Right. This is a good point to
Go ahead.
something.
Go.
Can you remember what you were going to say?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So part of the problem that we find nowadays, or even back then, was that Passover was a family celebration. It was not get everybody all around, all different families together and have it. No, it was a family celebration. It was done in a home. It was not done in a giant church with 1,000 people to serve bread and wine to. And so even the setting of it lends to a not accurate idea of what the Lord's Supper was originally like, quote unquote, Lord's Supper. And I think that's hard for certain people. Part of the discussion we had here in our own congregation was part of it were with some older people for whom communion was so important within the church, because remember, we founded the synagogue here and everybody else came from churches. So whether they were Jewish or not, they all came from having a church education. And 2 or 3 of the people on the council at that point were so, I'm going to say, in love with communion that they felt that we had to have it like often. Once again, because they were expecting something more than Passover. And they were expecting that Passover in some way could be celebrated all year long, which takes away from its really decisive views of, and its unique views. It's like Thanksgiving. Do you want to have Thanksgiving every week? Doesn't it make it like less special if you had Thanksgiving dinner every week? Wouldn't it become oh good, we get to do this again, have turkey again, and it's not, I'm so sick of turkey and stuff. But once a year, yes, we all enjoy it, I think, except for those of us who are working hard, but even we enjoyed it a certain way. But do you see what the problem is? Once you have the venue and the group together, as far as being a whole bunch of people from all different communities, meet together at one place, and now we're going to have a special thing that includes everybody. It's sitting there. You've already taken it out of its milieu. You've already taken it to some place it was never intended to go, I don't think. I mean, can you do it? Can people get something out of that kind of a ceremony? Sure. You know, human beings are amazingly flexible, and certain people still have worshipful feelings about this kind of thing. But we all have to realize this is not the way. This is not anywhere near like what it was. It's not. The whole thing is, once again, it's not wrong. It's a different cultural aspect of it. That's all
Yes.
I had to say.
Okay. And building somewhat on the cultural aspect, and I'm going to get back to the themes that continue from Havdalah that could be perfectly consistent with a celebration, then from Havdalah into a remembrance.
Well, you haven't mentioned what Havdalah
I'm going
is.
to. Okay.
Oh, okay.
I don't want to go there yet.
Okay.
This group is Havdalah. But the themes that would go from there on into what we call communion or Lord's Supper, I'll get to that in a minute. I want to do this cultural religious expectation thing just a little further. And that is part of this second question that's related to communion was, who's in, who's out, who can, who can't. If you make the connection to communion, the connection of communion to Passover, then you've got to raise a whole new set of questions that are often raised in the Christian churches. The Christian churches down through the years, and I'm going to add Messianic synagogues as well in many cases, will say that only those who are followers of Yeshua get to participate in communion or should participate in communion. Okay? I'm going to suggest that comes from a misreading and misunderstanding of 1 Corinthians 11 text. When Rav Shul was talking about, for lack of a better term, abuse or misuse of communion or the Lord's Supper, he wasn't talking about the wrong people were celebrating it. He was saying that the people who were celebrating it wrongly, with the wrong attitude, wrong perspective. That has come in Christian churches and in Messianic congregations who are very serious about communion in this sense, the Lord's Supper in this sense. That's often the question: who gets, who doesn't? Not how is it done most appropriately, and if
Who's allowed to have?
Who's allowed to have communion? How's it done most appropriately? If you maintain the communion connection to Passover, what is part near the very beginning of Passover, and in one sense, very much part of the heart of Passover? Yes, liberation from Egypt, but we say very early on, when we first reflect on the matzah, we say this is the bread of affliction, and then we go a little further, and then we say we invite those to join us who have not, because we remember that we were once slaves in Egypt.
And who don't have bread.
In other words, we bring in the needy, but we bring in the stranger as well. We bring in the stranger as well. That means strangers who are not part of the community, if they are in need and are somehow connected to us, are invited to join us. Because originally the Egyptians were invited to join us as well. So the idea of, I'm going to suggest, in this broader theological, historical, even religious sense, of communion against the backdrop of Passover is we invite others to join us. We're inclusive, we're not exclusive. What is communion by and large in the way it's celebrated today? Exclusive. What it needs to be, if it's understood against a backdrop of Passover, is that it's inclusive. do join us. Even if you don't understand the full meaning and connection to Yeshua's death, burial, and resurrection as the Lord's Supper or as communion, if you don't understand that, you're welcome to join us. You will get to understand that. It will become more meaningful to you. Once again, it's what Patrice said earlier on, another version of that, and that is, it's not Passover becomes what? A prototype of communion. No, it's communion of the Lord's Supper needs to be understood against its context, its foundation.
Within its context.
Yes.
It's that preposition.
I'm sorry. When I say again,
I know what you're saying.
and a couple of you heard this last night when we were talking about the Gospels against the Jewish background. It's not as opposed to, it's against the backdrop of
Within
the
Jewish context.
So anyhow, if you understand it within the context of Passover, then you understand it radically. I've always said radically. Yeah, radically differently. Does that make sense? All right, now I did promise a couple of themes, and I'm not going to spend much time on this because that's a whole different discussion. What are some of the themes of Havdalah that would have enabled the early congregations and fellowships of Messianic Jews to connect, to then celebrate how often they celebrated the Lord's Supper? Why would they have connected with Havdalah? Well, number one, they would not have had a chance to have their own particularly Messianic Jewish celebrations one Sunday. Why? Because if they were lucky, they got Saturday off. They didn't get Sunday off in the ancient Roman Empire.
Sunday is a work day.
Sunday's
You go to Israel today, Sunday
still a
is
work day.
Monday. Sunday is a work day, just plain old work day.
We got into enough trouble as Jews taking Saturdays off in the ancient world. So, and what are you doing on Saturday? You're spending your time in the synagogue. Well, as the day closes, you are also continuing your Jewish celebrations, and with Havdalah becomes the inauguration of what? The first day of the week. That's why when you have the reference to the first day of the week in Acts and in the letters of Rav Shaul, it's a reference not to Sunday morning, but
In about half an hour,
Shabbat
will be over and Sunday begins.
it's Saturday. The reference to Saturday night, which is the first day of the week. All right. How do we conclude Havdalah, which is, again, remember the springboard into the first day of the week? We sing what? Eliyahu HaNavi. What is Eliyahu HaNavi? Elijah the prophet, may he come quickly and bring with him the Messiah. What did Yeshua say? Celebrate this as often as you do it. He doesn't say how
He
often.
doesn't say how often it is, but every time you do it.
Every time you do it. Until I come. So just like Eliyahu HaNavi, there is the I until I come emphasis within Havdalah. If you understand Havdalah, which concludes Shabbat correct, if you understand Havdalah correctly as it concludes Shabbat, part of the lesson of Havdalah is this joy of Shabbat is intended with Havdalah to carry us through till the next Shabbat. So this carries us through until the next Shabbat. Now, taking the connector into the Lord's Supper again, we are looking for that Shabbat when Yeshua returns and does what? Inaugurates eternal Shabbat. So you can see how the themes of Havdalah would have been most appropriate for the early Jewish congregations to connect it with the Lord's Supper for communion as they understood it. I almost said again, against the background, within the context of Passover.
You can say against, but it just sounds so
I know,
adversarial.
it really does. So does that make sense? All right, so yeah, this gets kind of layered, and hopefully we've covered the important parts of the layering, and I think we've covered.
But can I just put my cherry on the
Please do.
topping of the cake, my
Yes.
cherry on top of the whipped cream on top of it. So taking you back to this guy who was in front of the 500 people on a stage, because we were going to have Shabbat worship on Friday nights. And so he's on the stage with the table, and he says
I know where
the
you're going.
things and John and I have just been in like messianic things for a couple years
Yeah,
tops.
maybe 2 years. Yeah.
And the group that's leading this Shabbat worship has been in the Messianic movement for like almost 10 years.
No, it was only 4 or 5.
4 or 5, but we consider them, they know more than we do. Because they've been working in the system that we were still trying to figure out how on earth we could be authentically Jewish and still have things about Messiah that were accurately conveyed. So he's on the stage and he says, so this, I'm going to do Kiddush, and here's the bread, and here is the wine. And everybody's dead serious because, it's the beginning of Shabbat worship. And then this guy says, I have wine and you guys don't. Ha ha.
Oh, how
And that's
For
when
Egypt.
I turned off my brain and I just look, he didn't want to look at me. And I just, yeah. So now it's really a miracle we ever became Messianic Jews after our experience.
We'll actually continue that.
Continue. Yeah, we said we're never going to be disrespectful and act like we're, 12 years old. Is that when you start crowing that you have wine and other people don't? I don't know. But anyway, that's what I remember about that whole.
Well,
I only
could
remember
set
the
that
things
free.
that disturb me and distress me. Yeah.
Okay.
The guy's no longer in the movement.
No, he is.
Oh, yeah, but I don't have to see him, so
No.
I don't hold it against him.
Although he's old enough that he might be, he's of retirement age, whether he is actually.
He led a congregation.
Yes.
I'll give you 10 cents for his name.
Yeah.
I know.
It wouldn't, it's a sort of a
After,
common name.
after we shut off the cameras,
It's a sort of a common name, so there
In
might be
Jewish circles,
somebody
yes.
with this name in a lot of communities.
yes. And by the way, this is a guy who was brought up as a Jew. We're not talking about a Gentile.
A Gentile's trying to be a Jew.
Who became part of a Messianic congregation early. This guy. And no, if I say much more, he becomes more identifiable. I'm not going to do that publicly because we're not supposed to.
But we grew out of that group.
Yes, we do. And he actually early on became part of our group. His congregation was one of the founding congregations at the Union of Messianic Jewish Immigrants. All right. We have a couple minutes if you have any further questions, either on this or related to it, or unrelated to it, sorry.
Unrelated. Okay. How to articulate this, correct?
Give it your best
I'm
shot.
going to give it. The churches in Asia that were mentioned throughout the New Testament, somebody wrote a letter to this one, they wrote a letter to Laodicea. Were they Gentile churches? Were they displaced Jewish churches? Or were they Gentile churches? What were they?
Okay, now,
I would mention the question.
that's exactly what I was going to do. Just in case that did not come through clearly on the audio, the question was, these churches that are mentioned, and they're mentioned both within the Acts as well as in the letters, the epistles of the Rabbi Rav Shaul.
And Revelation.
And I was going to get there. Yes, and they're clearly mentioned in Revelation. Were these churches Jewish churches or Gentile churches? What were they made up of? Okay, so that's the question. Okay, now, let me start with Revelation because I have a lot of fun with that. The churches of Revelation. And let me look behind me.
No, we do, but
It's not out.
it's not usable right now.
Oh, and yes, it's over there. But anyhow, if you look at those churches in the order in which they occur in Revelation chapters 2 and 3, and you follow them on a map, this is yet another reason for taking the basics historical geography of Bible answers. No, because it has maps in the back. Yes, if you look at the map and follow it, those congregations, or what are often translated churches, the order in which they're named would be the exact same order a person followed as he was leaving Israel and going through Asia Minor. So in effect, they're following the trade routes, so to speak. So for those who think these congregations or churches in the book of Revelation have to do with anything prophetic, and there are a lot of people who teach that, no, their order is not prophetic, it is geographic. You're just following the trade route. And if you follow that particular trade route and you look at those places, those are congregations that were founded in areas that have Jewish communities. And that's perfectly in keeping with two people, the author of Revelation, the Apostle John, or Yochanan HaShliach. They're perfectly in keeping with him because the other things he wrote some letters, but he also wrote the gospel, which is, other than Revelation, his main treatise. And the Gospel of John was clearly written, and again, this is a commercial for the course coming up, clearly written to Jews and about Jews. No non-Jews are mentioned in the Gospel. So that would be consistent then with what John is doing here in Revelation. When you look at, again, the journeys of the rabbi, Rav Shaul, through the book of Acts, they follow the same kind of pattern. They follow the trade routes, commercial centers. And in every one of those centers that he follows, and then cities to whom he writes, there is a strong Jewish community. Whether it's Ephesus or Corinth or Rome or Philippi, they are located in places that have Jewish communities. And you can tell that from the book of Acts because what's the first thing he does every time he comes to a new city? He goes to the synagogue first. What does that tell you? Two things. There's a synagogue there to go to. I know you needed me to tell you that. And second, he understands the centrality, the framework, the foundation of this message, and to whom it needs to go primarily, or at least initially. And that's the Jewish community. Now, as Patrice has mentioned in some of her writings, and you can see this in the chapter called Modern Day God-Fearers in the Enduring Paradox, I think you related it somewhat also in the book, the Kosher book. What is that called? Just Messianic Judaism, I think. No, that's the other book. We'll have to, it's on the table there. Anyhow, each of these Jewish communities had attracted Gentiles who would become part of the Jewish community by adopting at least a partial, if not a total Jewish lifestyle. So these congregations then, in effect, are Jewish congregations. Some are directly synagogue connected, some are not, but they all began in conjunction with the synagogue.
And they were there starting almost more than 700 years before Yeshua's time. How did Jews get in those communities? They're the remnants of the 10 lost tribes. There's only one bad piece of news. Actually, it's good. They were never lost.
No.
They were moved to other areas. They were moved to other nations. They were moved, they left, and they went and they formed new towns outside of the state of Israel. And that's where those synagogues come from. So by Yeshua's time, almost 750 years, there's been Jews in Philippi, and there's been Jews in Ephesus, and there's been Jews in Rome. So this should not surprise us, but that piece of history, somehow it fell out of people's heads. I don't know what's wrong with their brains. They went to bed and fell out. I don't know. But that's why he goes there. They have synagogues that were there since 722 BCE. And even when he says, and this was a big thing when I was in seminary, I heard a teacher say, well, Paul, the Apostle Paul, turned his back on the Jewish people because it says, lo, I turned to the Gentiles and I raised my hand. As I saw people nodding, I raised my hand and I said, please look in the next chapter. When the next town he goes to, it says, I went to the synagogue first, as was my want, as I normally,
as was my custom.
as was my custom. And everybody turned their head and looked at me because they had never heard. Here's what they had heard very clearly: lo, I turn to the Gentiles.
Yeah.
But they hadn't bothered to connect that to actual scripture, the very next chapter where it says, I returned to the synagogue when I got to the new city.
That story is the end of Acts 16. And in Acts 17, verse 2, it says, according to his usual practice, Rav Shaul went into the synagogue. And for 3 consecutive Sabbaths, I'll just read it from the Jewish Bible the way it is. On 3 Shabbats, he gave them drashes from the Tanakh. That's what the text is saying. So that's his usual practice throughout the book of Acts.
So there's a lot of misunderstanding about these
The nature of these-
scattered
Yeah.
Jewish churches. Yeah, synagogues. And synagogues, unlike what, once again, most people are taught that Jews could not even sit with Gentiles and have a meal together, which is not true. And that's not what's going on between Rav Shaul and Peter. That's not what the discussion is about, but that's what is taught in Christianity.
And in parts of Messianic Judaism.
And in parts of Messianic Judaism, because they're so hooked into particular Christian churches that they have to agree with these Christian churches in their doctrine. And also they don't know anything else. They don't learn anything.
That's how they were taught.
That's how they were taught. They're just following what they were taught. Now, what was my point? I forgot what it was.
Your main point was that we have Jewish communities outside of Israel.
And they invited, if you were interested in converting to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you would go to your local synagogue and you would sit in on some services when they had services. And if you were really interested, you would talk to people and say, I really like this. How can I learn more about this? And they would sign you up for their discipleship program. Did this happen often? Well, during Yeshua's lifetime, it happened quite a lot, actually. And the people who would come to synagogues in all of these outlying places, this is not in Israel, this is in all of these diaspora places, were oftentimes women. There was a ton of women who were attracted by what and how they lived their lives as followers of God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we know that from history, but we also, you have an inkling of it because Rav Shaul goes and talks to Lydia, the seller of purple. Lydia was evidently one of the important people at the synagogue in Philippi. She may have been originally a Gentile who converted finally to Judaism. So they would assume if you liked Judaism and you came and you learned from the rabbis and you learned and you studied and you heard about scriptures and you learned everything, and then you could convert to Judaism. And that was somewhat common during Yeshua's life. That was a common thing. And different groups of Jews would send out emissaries to these different congregations all throughout the diaspora and see how they're doing on their discipleship and how big they are, how rich they are. And the women who came, who were very attracted by that, not so many men, but women were attracted. They were relatively wealthy. So these are not, poor, bedraggled people off the street. These are women who have enough wherewithal to make decisions. And so the viewpoint that most people have within Christianity of the status of these congregations that are being spoken about, both in Revelation and in Rav Shaul, they misunderstand the whole thing. And they don't really want to know. They would rather think what they think. Because I actually had a professor, not at my seminary, but I had a professor who actually said to me, if that's true, it changes everything. And I was breathless when he said that. And I did not say anything in response to that. But I went home and I was thinking, well, maybe it does need change. Maybe. We need to keep learning stuff. It was about Jewish stuff.
And because I'm proud of this, that was a professor at Princeton by the way, so she was there.
Seminary Princess.
I'm trying to find that text to give you where the latest stories. I thought it's Acts 16, but I'm not seeing it there.
And he's Mr. Acts, he's Mr. New Testament, and I'm more Tanakh, and so I don't know exactly where some of these are. It's not in Philippians,
What do you mean, Philippians?
Lydia,
Yeah, Lydia, yes, but I don't, but what I'm looking for is where this.
she's also in Acts,
Yes, that's where the story occurs. It occurs in Acts.
ladies and gentlemen. He's looking for you. And by the way, there were no maps in either of these Bibles, so
Not in this
we
one?
got totally ripped off.
Wow.
No, this might make them $3 more expensive to put maps in.
All right, well, I'm not finding it quickly.
That'll be your assignment. Go home and
But
find Lydia.
all you have to do is,
Google it.
concordance and find Philip.
Wikipedia, much easier. Just go and Lydia Seller Purple.
I think so.
Yeah, I think she was in Volga,
Um,
which is called something else nowadays.
oh, and this doesn't even have a concordance.
No,
My
I told
God.
you. because
No,
it
no,
makes
no
sense.
wonder I had to decorate it this way.
See, we have, you should show our people in, see, we have the manly macho Yeshua, which back in this early 70s, this was the greatest picture ever of Yeshua, because the rest of them all
Backside's
looked
not
like
bad either.
wimps and no, this is the best one. But
Yeah, that's
the rest of them all look like wimps. and
What's the
wussies.
problem with the picture?
It's something that's not there.
Oh, no keeper.
And here is a line on that. So your average everyday Christian who knows something will say, well, they didn't come up with the beanies until the Middle Ages, except that's not true either. They had head coverings. They may have looked more like mats. Mats comes down. He has more of a cap on the top of his head, so it doesn't fly off like this one does, unless we have to use, staples on this one. Or super glue. But
That's not what they were done. Just a second.
he has Velcro.
It's Velcro.
All right, are we almost done? Because we need to dismiss.
Yeah,
the
I was, and do have dollars since we talked about it.
Yeah, but-
I get set up.
No, we don't have time. It'll take you 10 minutes to get set up.
All right. I hate to not do have dollar when we've talked so much about it.
Yeshua forgives us.
I don't mind the backside. I will show it.
It's yeah,
It's
another
him
one.
it's him as shepherd.
Back in the
Same problem.
back in the
No
60s and
keep-off.
70s, they totally revamped the concept of
Oh, with the blonde hair and the blue eyes.
Yeah.
eyes and the this kind of look like a puppy dog who's wants you to feed him a bite of food, No, Yeshua. This is Yeshua smiling, and this is Yeshua
As a shepherd.
as a shepherd,
Okay,
actually chiseled.
just a final thought on what she was saying. Congregations elsewhere, under Assyria and Babylon, we were forcibly scattered throughout their empires. Later on, we went to other places voluntarily, so that by Yeshua's time, probably 3/4 of the Jewish people were not in the land of Israel.
And they were still good Jews. And the other Jews in the other areas still thought they were good Jews.
They were-
Not all good Jews lived in Israel.
They were all part of the Jewish
They
community.
were all part of the larger worldwide Jewish.
So the tribes were never lost. But I'm thinking estimates of the Jewish population in the Roman Empire in the first century were somewhere around 8.5 million, of which you had 2.5 million who lived in Israel. So,
And that's actually more in total than are alive now.
no,
What's the worldwide Jewish community?
probably 15 million.
Sorry.
But again, that's just the Roman Empire. It doesn't include those who had gone beyond the edges of it.
Yeah. Doesn't include the eastern territories.
Okay, then I guess we are done. Yes, it is 8:30, so it is kind of late, but thank you for your patience.
Thank you for the question.
And for the question.
Obviously, good question.
These are always so interesting.
Well,
Thank you.
we hope people think so. You can't tell everything you know, at any point, unless you want to have a bunch of really bored friends. Or family definitely don't want to know, and your friends don't want to know. So it's always nice to be able to talk about things we don't get to talk normal. We don't get to say these kinds of things. It used to be in membership classes, he would say some of these. So,
Yeah.
or maybe we've got new stuff that are not in the membership classes, because that happens too. What are we looking at?
I was giving him one last shot at Lydia,
And also, he's persistent, and he will continue to look it up. Wikipedia will be so much easier.
I've got a concordance again, but either way.
Okay, you can continue this when you let the
All
people
right.
go. I'm always thinking of you people. I'm always thinking of you.
All right,
He's busy in his mind, but I'm
in that case, then you can make it official.
in brain.
Yes.
Let's close in prayer. Heavenly Father, you are a great God, and it is a privilege to serve you. Help us to learn more about you. Help us to get good information and to share it with others. Help us to put our eyes always on you and follow your footsteps in our lives. Teach us when your footsteps might take us in what we think are strange places. Give us courage and bless our way as we continue to follow you day by day, step by step, mornings, noons, evenings, because we know we are dependent on the fact that you're always with us. And for that, we are so thankful. Hashem Yeshua, Meshikenu, in the name of Yeshua, our Messiah. Amen.
Amen. Okay. Again, thank you all. Thank you for joining us, whether it's virtually or, I was going to say up close and personal, but at least personal, even if not quite up close.
And